do what we can. All right, well, thanks again, you guys, for showing up. I'll do my best to try to look at both the room and the computer at the same time. Well, I think it's it's felt like spring all season, but I think it's officially sprung in the last few weeks. It's pretty warm out there. Okay, so we're going to start by talking about kind of some general springtime avalanche concerns. Go turn it down a little bit. I think the one that's usually top of mind for us is the loose wet avalanche concern. We call these point releases or sometimes wet sloughs, but in general they start at a single point and they entrain a lot of snow as they fan out down the slope. And they can grow quite large in size and start moving pretty fast. I think generally we think of them as more small in size, but they can get quite big. And this happens when that top layer of snow really moistens up and stiffens up, and we get that classic sort of more dense snow on top of less dense snow. Really common after a fresh storm event, the first sunny day, especially later in the year that we have now with the higher sun angles and just generally more solar input. As I mentioned, they can get quite large. This one came down last season in the Mendenhall Couloir. I believe this was skier triggered. They can also be naturally triggered, often rockfall or some sort of falling snow, maybe off the tree bone, etc. might trigger one of these. We can see this one got quite large. Another example, this is on the backside of the Sherwins. A couple years ago, we had a little more snow there. A little more concerning, but another springtime avalanche concern are these wet slab avalanches. Generally speaking, these are involving some sort of buried weak layer and a good bed surface. Sometimes that bed surface can be the ground, or it can be mid-pack. But we do need that weak layer to be kind of initiated to create the slab avalanche. Now, these can be much larger in size and more destructive, and they can, often be really difficult to predict. They tend to be quite large. Not always, but generally speaking, they can be quite big and destructive. This is actually up on Mount Hood a few years ago. This is me standing above the crown for reference. But this was almost a mile wide. And this is the top of the debris fan. You can see on the right side of the screen here, those are all trees that are folded down into sort of an ice wall. This wall of kind of smeared and pressured snow that turned into kind of this sheer ice wall is about 30 feet, 40 feet high. And we estimated the debris to be about 70 feet deep at the deepest point, further down in the path. These are the type of avalanches that can really kind of change the landscape and gouge into the earth, and again, just be quite destructive. It's really wet, dense, heavy snow. This is on the back side of Mammoth and Fresno Bowl. This one actually kind of changed the belly feature on the back side of Mammoth a couple years ago. And yeah, wet slab avalanches. These are generally more of a concern on big warm-up days, or days when we see a significant kind of rain on snow event. Would be the big times I'd worry about these. But like I said, we do need that weak layer, right? And sometimes these weak layers are created really early in the season. This is a pit from last season, but you can see we have these facets down on the bottom of the snowpack and generally kind of upside down structure. And this is the type of situation where we might be more concerned about a wet slab avalanche. And then, of course, just like the rest of the year, we do have concerns around new snow, right? So if we see significant precip events, we have a renewed cycle, right? We might see storm slabs, wind slabs, even loose dry avalanching. And then, of course, once the sun comes out the next day or a few days later, whatever it might be, and we see the sun come back, the warmer days come back, we might see those wind slabs still be kind of sensitive, and then we might shift towards more loose wet concern. But just because it's springtime doesn't mean we're out of the woods on new snow concerns. So the things we really want to pay attention to in the spring that might be a little different. I mean, they're the same all throughout the season, but kind of specifically in the springtime, we want to pay attention to those daily weather drivers, right? What's the sun doing? What's the wind doing? Is there any precip? What are the daytime temps? And more importantly, what are the overnight temps? We really want to make sure that we're having that overnight freeze. If we see a weak refreeze, or maybe none at all, that's when things can really heat up quickly in the morning. But that overnight freeze really kind of locks it back up, and it takes time for it to loosen up again. But without that, it really can do some damage. And one factor to consider is overnight cloud cover, especially after a nice warm day. So if we had a big sunny morning and the clouds came in the afternoon, we might start to see some greenhousing effect, where that solar radiation is kind of being bounced around in the atmosphere, like, without escaping the snowpack. And it keeps the heat higher towards the earth. And if those stick around overnight, that'll really kind of drive that warmer air temp and keep the ground from refreezing. Actually, there's one way to check this out is we have our weather sensor app on the website. Just go to the weather tab up top. You go down to the sensor app, and it pulls up this. This is kind of all the stations within the forecast area, and even just kind of right outside of it. You can look at graphs to see how cold it's been getting, warm it's been getting. And then through the Mammoth Patrol website, there are links to the USCB weather station up at McCoy, and they have a surface temperature sensor. So I'd encourage you to check that out. And then out in the field, what are some signs of warming? What are the things we should be looking for? Really, anytime you see recent avalanche activity, right, we kind of define that within the last 48 hours. With warming, we're really more concerned if you're seeing it today, right? If it froze last night, I'm worried more if you're seeing loose wet avalanching already today. That's a good sign that things are becoming unstable. Roller balls and pinwheels. Once it starts pinwheeling like this and the snow really turns into that cinnamon roll and it's growing and growing and growing in size, that's a good sign that it's really moistening up on the surface. And it's probably still pretty cold just under the surface, so it's sticking to itself. If you see the globbing on your skins, it's another good sign of that sort of moist snow on top of cold snow. And then, of course, if you're sinking into the snow like this, that increasing glue penetration is something we talk about often in the forecast. And if you're over boot top deep on a slope that had been frozen before, that's definitely a good sign that it's time to kind of treat to a more shaded aspect. It's becoming more unstable on that slope. And then, of course, rockfall is a huge concern in the springtime. Really, any time that it warms up and there's the snow kind of frozen on the rock faces, it might loosen big rocks and boulders. So we definitely want to be careful about that when we're moving out there, and watch for falling rock above you. But it's another good sign that things are warming up. So in the springtime, one of the benefits of beautiful weather and generally lower avalanche concerns and greater stability is we can start kind of going deeper in the range, we can go higher in elevation, we can start seeking out these kind of steeper, more extreme lines. And it's important to remember that when we are in couloirs, skiing in couloirs, we're really stuck in there. There's not always a good escape, right? So we want to be mindful of that when we're ascending or descending, that if anything does happen in there, we're putting ourselves into a pretty tight situation, kind of literally, where we might not be able to escape a hazard, whether it be an avalanche or a rockfall, or other people, hazards posed by that. And we also want to be careful of other types of terrain traps, right? Gully features, cliff bands. If we're above a cliff band, maybe a stand of trees, other terrain features like, or one that comes to mind right now is just generally shallow coverage. If we're skiing something that ends before we hit a flat zone, that wide swath of dry ground below whatever we're skiing might be another type of terrain trap. It's really just anything that kind of intensifies the consequence if something goes wrong, trigger an avalanche. But especially with like loose wet concern, these springtime concerns, I'd like to be very mindful of traveling in gully features or in these benches under big slopes, because often these things can kind of start above you naturally, and then you're still kind of right in the way, right? So you want to be mindful of those terrain traps. So just kind of recap and talk about the avalanche concerns. You know, often we're talking about stability changes on a daily basis that can be quite rapid, right? It might be low danger in the morning and rise rapidly throughout the day. So we want to be mindful of that big change. We don't always see that as much in the midwinter. We sometimes see a danger rating that stays more consistent throughout the day, but in the spring it can change quite rapidly throughout the day. We want to be really mindful of what the weather's doing today, really check the timing of things, and continually check those weather inputs. So when we're in the field, we're checking temps, we're watching for changes in the wind. Is it warmer today than we expected? Is the sun out when it was supposed to be cloudy? Things like that. Pay attention to those overnight refreeze, and really start early. That's like the best advice you can get in the spring. Because of that rapidly changing stability, it's almost always going to decrease. Your stability is going to decrease throughout the day as it warms up. So if you can be in a position to ski your line when the timing's right and out of there before the conditions worsen, that's always beneficial to starting late. And really, don't ever hesitate to turn around. It's usually like you're starting to see those signs of decreasing stability. It's only going to get worse throughout the day, generally speaking. So the longer you push it, the kind of more at risk you are, right? And then, as always, you know, it's always recommended to expose one person at a time. Kind of just general safety protocols still apply. So one hazard I think this is a hazard all the time, but other people and what they're doing can be something to think about. And I think in the springtime, especially here in the Sierra, this is sort of a destination for the spring, right? We've got the corn skiing that people crave, and they come out here and want to do these big missions. And sometimes we're in exposed areas. When you're skiing the glory lines here on the east side, they tend to be pretty extreme lines, right? They're steep, they're long, they got those tight chokes, etc. And just be mindful of where other people are around you, right? Like if maybe you started a little later and there's already a group above you, that's definitely something to think about. Are they going to be kicking off snowballs or rocks, etc.? What's going to happen when they start skiing? If they trigger an avalanche, am I at risk of being hit by that? Does that change my risk assessment for the day? Yeah, so I think just like any time during the season, being willing to turn around, pick a new objective, being flexible with your plan is always important. And it doesn't necessarily change in the spring. But you kind of want to be, I guess, maybe a little more mindful earlier in the day, because sometimes these objectives take a lot of investment to get to, right? So be aware of the people around you. So other spring terrain and travel concerns, we often have really tricky access, right? When we're going to these bigger areas, maybe we're starting to see the roads melt out, or those kind of long morainal features that we used to be able to ski during midwinter are starting to kind of melt out, patchy coverage, etc. So be ready for that. Start early. Understand what the conditions might be like. Be ready for the unknowns of it. You're generally talking about a lot bigger days, right? If we're going for the high peaks and those stellar lines, we might really want to start in the dark. Might be an alpine start. Not uncommon here on these sides to start like 2 in the morning, maybe earlier, depending on where you want to go. So that, begs the question of like, what are some other equipment needs you might have? Will there be more layers for those colder, darker starts? Headlamps for the morning and the evening if you get stuck out, etc. And then one thing to keep in mind is that we don't publish the forecast until 7 a.m. So if you wake up and you're reading the forecast at 4 a.m., it's probably from yesterday. So you definitely want to make sure you're checking the date of that forecast and kind of anticipating what might have changed given the weather inputs last night. And then you also want to be mindful of the snow conditions, right? Often in the spring we see this refreeze at night, so we have these hard and slick surfaces. Now in a season like this one, we've seen that kind of all season, right? So you might be well acquainted with your crampons already. But bringing things like crampons for your boots, an ice axe or a whippet, a helmet for rockfall, ice, and just always generally a good idea to have a helmet with you. And then ski crampons for those, when you still want your skis on your feet, but it can be quite hard to skin on. So these things are always a good idea when it's hard to look out. They can be totally crucial as well. Another concern, so I'm kind of out of order here, but cornice falls, another avalanche concern. So in this, we sometimes see these cornices grow throughout the season as we get different storm inputs, and they can be an avalanche concern of their own. They can be a huge fall hazard, and they can also trigger other avalanches, right? It's a fairly large trigger when a big cornice breaks loose. But the one thing to consider when approaching a cornice, like this guy over here, is that they can break a lot further back than you might expect. So if you know you're kind of approaching a cornice and you want to be mindful of that, I would always recommend being on the rocks. Because they can definitely, you might think you're on the right side of the edge, but it can still break behind you. It's definitely led to some serious injury and death in the past, so worth considering. So another terrain hazard, stream crossings that start to melt out. So we may have to navigate open water. We might start to see the lake start to melt out and become more hazardous. So we might be used to an approach that crosses the lake that's now becoming more hazardous, something to think about. And then these snow bridges, sometimes crossing the creek is not always glamorous, and sometimes it's quite wet. So we might look for those snow bridges, right? But just like the snow itself, those other, the boot penetration, et cetera, like the melting of the snow during the day, those snow bridges are kind of weak as well. So we want to be careful when we approach those. Do it cautiously. Always a better idea to find land to walk across, whether it be rocks or fallen trees, or in the creek. Travel in that deep, wet snow. It can be quite arduous, right? Like maybe it's crossing a flat valley. It's not actually quite an avalanche concern. Maybe it's not steep enough to be concerning. But traveling in really deep, loose, unconsolidated snow can be quite difficult. If you do find yourself in this type of snow on a slope, it can be really hazardous. It can be a good sign of decreasing stability. Yeah, so be careful with that stuff. It can also be really hazardous skiing in this stuff. If you're skiing down even a lower angle slope or whatever, in this really punchy, unsupported snow, it can be hard on your knees, lead to injury, things like that. And you're dropping deeper into the snowpack, so you might encounter obstacles like bushes and rocks and fallen trees that you may not be able to see from the surface. We do have some high quality bushwhack skiing here, whether it be crossing dry patches or thick bunches of trees, those creeks, etc. I try to always wear eye protection when bushwhacking. Sun protection is huge. Goggle tans are cool. Cancer sucks. So cover up out there. I always recommend wearing more clothing, long sleeves, maybe a bandana under your hat, something like that. Those really stylish like beaks for your sunglasses help keep your nose. I really like sun gloves also. When it's too hot to wear my insulated gloves. But I think, when in doubt, sunscreen's always a good idea. And covering up is going to be better. And then really, I think, just like throughout the entire season, being prepared for the unexpected is really important. And I think especially in the springtime, it becomes more top of mind for me because we're often skiing on really hard and rough surfaces. Our equipment takes a bigger beating. It may have been taking a beating all season as well. And also because we're going further out, often, not always. But if we're going bigger days, deeper in the range, etc., we're just that much further from help, right? So being prepared to address those issues on our own is important. Whether that be carrying those extra layers, even if it's going to be a t-shirt weather day skiing, I always have a down jacket and some warm mittens and a hat, right? Even if they just live in the bottom of the pack. And part of the reason is if I get stuck out there and have to bivvy, I'm going to be really grateful to have those warmer layers. Or if someone gets injured, they're going to be grateful for that. A first aid kit, always a good idea. Sometimes I carry a rescue sled, just a small kind of tarp that we can wrap someone in and drag them out. Never really a bad idea, but especially if I'm going farther, I'll throw that thing in. Repair kits. You know, these look different depending on your equipment and what you might have to fix. But thinking about the things that might break, that would really suck to break, and think about how you would deal with that can set yourself up for success. One thing I always have is a spare pole basket. If you lose that pole basket, that can be a real pain. These volet straps are really useful. They can fix broken boots, they can tie your foot to the ski, they can work for splinting injured limb. Really, really helpful. Extra food and water. Be prepared for those extra long days. You know, it might be a bigger objective, which means it's probably going to cost you more calories of moving. So being prepared by bringing enough food and extra water, because it's also really hot out there. Sometimes we do have that open water, and bringing something like a water filter might not be a bad idea if you know there's going to be water to filter. I also know some folks who carry one of a mini jet boil just to make water. But being prepared with the things you might need. A cell phone's never a bad idea, but just because it doesn't always work, you know, having something like an inReach device or a Spot, one of those satellite messenger devices, and sort of personal locating beacons can be a really great idea for communication and initiating a rescue should you need it. And that's about it for springtime concerns. But we're going to go into our season history. Does anyone have any questions here in the room before we move on? Anything in Zoom world? Okay, great. Well, our season started in October. For those of you who are around here, it was actually, I think, one of the wettest Octobers on record for the Sierra in general. So it set up the water table really well in early winter. It's almost 40 inches of snow here. All these numbers come from Mammoth Mountain, base of Mammoth. So we saw higher totals often in higher elevations, near the crest, etc. But we did have about a month of high pressure after that, through November, and it got quite warm. So we saw a lot of that snow kind of recede to upper elevations, northerly aspects. But that did kind of set the scene for the snowpack in December. Now in December, we had the wettest December on record. And what was really kind of unique for us was that we had really prolonged storm systems. It kind of snowed all through December. We did have a couple really large events, but we also had several smaller ones that just kind of kept it coming, which was pretty awesome. We had a really active avalanche cycle in December. Almost 30 avalanches reported in the month of December and several close calls. But we did see that sort of persistent weak layer develop on the base where that October snow was still present. It was pretty sporadic where that was. Again, kind of northerly aspects, higher elevations. But generally speaking, we are more concerned with wind slabs, storm slabs, things like that. One of the close calls we had several roof avalanches in town and one up on Mammoth Mountain. That was a pretty close call. 2 people interacted with that, both alive. This is a remotely triggered wind slab from the Red Cone area that snuck up on a couple folks out there. Yeah, gave them a good spook. They didn't actually interact with this avalanche. They didn't go for a ride, but definitely was an eye-opener for them. Pretty complex terrain they were traveling in, the Lakes Basin. Several wind slabs across the range. You can actually still see this crown line, believe it or not. This is outside of June, kind of towards Carson. But I think the most impressive avalanche that we saw was kind of during the end of our storm system. This was actually up on Mammoth Mountain, Paranoids here. This was a big persistent slab avalanche. Correct me if I'm wrong, Mike, but I believe it's size 3. 3.5. And it ran the debris. I think you can still see the debris kind of down your chair lap. And there were several other kind of large crown lines around the range that we saw, but we couldn't really confirm whether they were just big wind slabs or if maybe they interacted on more of this persistent nuclear. But you can tell this one ran down to the ground. And what's interesting about this one is that this terrain was open, I believe, on open day, so since the end of October. So had a lot of skier compaction, but it still had that weak layer and was reactive to the mega load of December. And then January came and we saw 0 precipitation in the month of January. There may have been a couple flakes at one point or another, but nothing was measurable. Generally speaking, we saw things stabilize. We saw a lot of kind of dwindling coverage, but it held on pretty well for January. I was quite impressed personally how well things skied considering the lack of new snow. But we did start to see a lot of variable and challenging surface conditions develop. A lot of that really hard and slick surface. We started getting our crampons out early on in January for those slide for life conditions. A couple other notable close calls. We had a few people kind of report slide for life incidents or filtering through the grapevine. These steps, this is an hourglass of June Mountain. And they were put in by Search and Rescue going up there to help a couple that did the traverse from Mammoth actually get down the slope. And I think these steps really provided a great access through the hourglass for others heading up there. But no major injury or big scare with those guys. I think they might have had a fall that led to a slide on the way over and were a little spooked heading down this slope. So Search and Rescue went up and created this great staircase. But one of the scarier ones was we heard reports of a skier who had climbed up to the top of Mendenhall here. This is the Pinnercoolar. It's outside of Convict. They took a fall about 3 turns into this and they slid all the way to the bottom. Luckily, no super significant injuries, but definitely a scary slide for life situation. So we definitely want to take those hard and slick surfaces seriously. Because even an otherwise kind of innocuous fall can be really bad. I think this is almost 3,000 feet of sliding and fairly narrow. In February, our dry spell continued for a long time. The first half or so of February, we actually saw quite a bit of this kind of near surface faceting taking place on more northerly and shaded aspects. And there's actually fairly good kind of recycled powder skiing. Continued to see dwindling coverage, and we saw a couple small storms through the month, but in general, we were losing snowpack. Saw some really impressive surface hoar growth. This is these are chunks of surface hoar that were probably about, I don't know, this big. Really impressive. Never seen anything that big. Generally, kind of near open water in flatter areas. We had a lot of those cold, weird nights with a lot of low wind days. Found some fairly advanced facets holding on at the bottom of the snowpack in some areas. And these were kind of cool. These are penitentes that had formed on more of a southerly aspect. These were about 2 feet in length or so, and you can tell that the sun is still fairly low in the sky because they're all kind of angled out there. But definitely made for some interesting conditions on solar aspects. And then March came along and we started to see a little more snow. So those of you who've been skiing this month probably know that we saw a lot more than 3.5 inches up kind of near the crest. A lot of the storms that came, all the storms that have come in this month so far have produced more snow towards the crest and in higher elevations. But we saw kind of renewed avalanche activity. We saw a natural wind slab here in Jaws. This was about 2 weeks ago now. And yeah, some more powder skiing came to the range, which is kind of great. We did see a lot of shifting winds though, as we often do. So we would see the storm came in with a kind of southwest flow, and then those winds shift to the north and kind of strip all that soft snow off the north, redistribute it. It brings us back to more of those variable surface conditions, which we all know and love. Mammoth has definitely sort of been the epicenter for all these storms in the fact that they're getting more snow than down south in the Michigan area, or even for some of these up north. We had a lot of the inside slider events, which are kind of coming from the north and the east. And those can be kind of sporadic in how they distribute precipitation. So made for some tricky forecasting. But our most recent storm, I think, was probably the best skiing storm in general, or that southwest flow. We've seen some very warm temps here in March as that sun has got even higher. We did have some rain on snow yesterday. Luckily, the amount of precipitation was fairly low. So we did see a little bit of loose wet activity. That rain and snow line kind of crept up in elevation more than we expected. But in general, I'd say what we're really seeing most of is waning coverage. We're starting to see those snow lines creep up. Some of that access is starting to open up a little more. And yeah, so that's kind of where we stand now. We've got some of this new snow still skiing soft out there, and then we've got a lot of hard surfaces out there, a lot of variability in coverage and conditions. So looking forward, hopefully we see some more precip. In the near future, we have a brief storm coming in this weekend that may provide a few inches of snow. We'll see, hopefully it overproduces. But otherwise, I think we're going to continue to see these really warm temps. So break out that sunscreen and hope for the best. Yeah, enjoy the views. That's the thing I hold on to for sure. Yeah. So anyways, that's kind of where we're at. And, you know, don't give up yet. We've definitely seen really huge storm events in March and April. So all hope is not lost. There's still skiing out there. It's still beautiful. And, yeah. Any questions?
Good. Well, this kind of had to do with the first part, but how do you assess when a lake is no longer safe to cross?
That's a great question. So the question was, how do you assess a lake to make sure it's still safe to cross? I'm not an ice skater, so I may not be the best person to answer this. But I think if the lake has been snow covered and frozen and I start to see it look more blue and wet, that's when I'm not going. I think the rule of thumb for ice skaters is like at least 2 inches, 4 inches, something like that. And those ice screws can be really good for that. We'll go with 4. Let's be conservative. Yeah, I mean, if you see open water patches, big red flag. Yeah. Anything else to add? Anyone that knows? Yeah. Yeah, I think if it's looking wet, that's definitely a reason not to go. Anything else?
What's your springtime red flag temp increase? Still like standard 10 to 15?
Like rapid warming?
Yeah.
You know, I think it's, for me, I'm thinking more about what's happening to the snow. You know, we can see quite warm temps and still have an overnight freeze. But I'm really more worried about what's happening within the snow. So if I have cold snow that's getting really moist and wet, that's when I start to be more concerned, especially without that overnight freeze. And with the solar is huge. So one of the things that we're starting to see now, more so than we kind of saw in the midwinter, is that sun is starting to impact more of the compass rose. It's not solely on those solar aspects. And you can start to see that kind of upside down nature occurring more often on snow that stayed cold for for months. So, yeah. Do you guys have a rule of thumb for temperatures? Yeah.
New snow that's getting rapidly warmed, you get a dump and then it gets really hot right away. It's generally going to be a lot more dangerous than really baked down old snow that's cooked down and consolidated with it rapid warm up, right? So the biggest red flag is getting that good refreeze overnight. And Steve mentioned it, but I just wanted to mention it one more time on the Patrol Mammoth Mountain site. It's on the bottom table on additional info, and it's the UCSB site for Santa Barbara. And that gives you an actual surface temperature at 9,500 feet of McCoy Station, so you can see like how hard was the freeze. And that's like, we look at that every day. And that's a really good one for you to look at to see how hard the freeze was overnight. One of the worst things is not getting that freeze overnight. It's already mushy and shit before you go out there, you know, so.
This is where you find it. So if you go to the patrol.mammothmountain.com website here, if you don't know this already, this is a fantastic resource for weather observations. You can get wind gauges in various locations on the mountain. But down here at the bottom, under additional info, this one that says Q's UCSB site, it'll take you to that weather station, and under charts and tables, it's right here at the top. So there's time. So you can see that last night it got down to -12 on the surface. Now you do kind of want to pay attention to what happened yesterday too, because one thing we saw today was that it froze the surface, but it was actually still kind of moist underneath in a lot of areas, especially lower elevations. But in general, yeah, the surface temp is kind of more important than the air temp.
There's a question here, Steve. If we get more precip, would that facet layer be a concern?
If we get more precip, will the facet layers be concerning? In general, yes. We saw a lot of our snowpack on more northerly and shaded aspects become quite faceted throughout our dry spell, which has been really since the end of December. And that I think is more concerning right now, and that it's becoming really punchy and unsupportive. So it's not necessarily the slab concern, which I think is the basis of the question, but might contribute to more kind of loose wet at this point. But if we see a big load on that, and then we start to see that warm up again, then we might be talking more slab. That's right. Yeah.
Setup. You get a really big load.
Totally, yeah. Chris just brought up an avalanche that occurred in the Paiute Crags 2 springs ago, kind of right after lockdown started for quarantine. And that was a good example of having a long dry spell that we created these kind of lower faceted layers. And then a big load came in. I think it was over 2 feet, maybe a couple of days before they were out there. Awesome. So one last thing I'd love to mention, you guys, is that we are in a comment period for our OHB grant at ESAC. And we would love your feedback, even, no matter where you sit on your opinions of snowmobile access, et cetera, your opinion matters and really helps us secure that funding. So if next time you're on the ESAC website, if you wouldn't mind posting a comment here at the bottom of the main page, I'd be super grateful to get your feedback. And it really helps us kind of maintain our funding and provide a better forecast and a better service for you guys. So if there are no more questions, thanks for coming out, you guys. We will be around and ready to make it.